1696. And the little carriage house, which you can just barely see on the far right distance, was eventually moved around the corner and became what is now the first house on the right side of Frankwood Avenue as you go down that street.
Now this picture dates 1912, but the house itself, you were saying, goes back to the late 1600s.
Oh yes, yeah, the 1690s, and strangely enough, it's been very, very little altered since that time from what I can see.
Yeah.
A little tiny bit of detail has changed, but that's about all.
And of course the Cressy name is synonymous with Beverly, Beverly's heritage.
Oh sure.
In fact, we met one of the relatives, I think, at the Historical Society just about a week ago when we were planning the program. One of the
That's right, and this is one of his relatives.
Identified himself as a relative of this fellow.
Yeah, I believe so.
Yeah. Hazel Robertson picture.
Yes.
She is responsible for donating this picture.
Correct.
And we hope that you people will, if you have some of these old pictures that you'd like to, you're wondering what to do with, the Society would certainly love to have them.
That's right. That's right, absolutely, because
they'll have a permanent home.
Yeah, people have snapshots in their possession and they think, well, these aren't exciting, there's nothing here that would interest anybody, but sometimes they would, and they really shouldn't just toss things out without at least checking with the Historical Society. You never know. We had a fellow send us, in fact, somebody connected with the next picture sent us a photograph just this week showing a couple of his relatives playing ball in their side yard, but in the background was a picture of a house next to theirs, and that's a picture of a house that we don't have. So you just never know what's in those pictures, and you really shouldn't dispose of them without checking.
And ID them if they can.
If you can, sure. That's always a big help.
Yeah. All right, now the next picture here, we have 1913 vintage, and we're on 77 Conant Street, I believe, and take it from there, Rich.
We know it's 1913 because the license plate on this 1904 Franklin automobile is clearly marked Massachusetts in 1913. And this is at the base of Cherry Hill, and the car belonged to the Hay family, and Thelma and Kenneth Hay are seen in the car as children. And Kenneth Hay was the one that just sent me the picture this week showing some of his relatives in the house that I just mentioned. Yeah. So he's still around. He's living in Wisconsin.
Yeah. To own an automobile in those days was something. It was a prestigious.
Sure.
To have a car.
To have the money to have a car.
Yeah.
Because we look back now, and you could have probably purchased an automobile back then for $300 or $400, but the average family perhaps only made $300 or $400 in a year. So, not everybody had one, that's for sure. You just simply couldn't afford it. And they were sort of not really tried and true at that point either. I mean, every time you set foot in it, it was an adventure. You didn't know if you were going to come back or push it back.
Yeah. Kenneth Hay picture.
Right.
Okay. We have next Viola Brock and in her cow carriage.
Ah, yeah, and we had another picture. There were two pictures of this that surfaced when we were doing the book, and we printed them, and this, I think, was the most interesting one of the two, simply because of the way it's posed with the cow facing the camera. And this seems to be nothing more than a baby stroller that she's hooked up with chains to the cow. Cow seems to be carrying some sort of rig that a horse would wear to pull a wagon. It's got a horse collar on.
Wonder what the cow thought of all this.
You wonder what the cow thought, and you wonder what people thought. Apparently she did go around North Beverly in this thing, because, as I say, two pictures at least have surfaced of this. One over on Enon Street. And the interesting thing is that being a stroller, it really wasn't made to be towed, because the front axle does not steer, does not turn. So therefore, if the cow turns left or right, it literally drags the front end of this stroller sideways until it's facing the direction of travel. Again, there's no way to actually steer it as such. And I wonder how many times it tipped over and threw Miss Brock out on the sidewalk or whatever. But this is one of those strange things that sort of becomes legend in its own time.
We can assume, though, the cow wasn't all that swift and probably...
I don't think anybody probably got hurt. No, I wouldn't think so.
Okay. There's no date on that one, by the way.
No,
and again,
I would think turn of the century is a pretty safe bet.
Contributed by Hazel Robertson, I have here in my notes. Okay, our next picture is the Millet House. Millet House, 65 Conant Street, about 1914, Rich.
Right, and we see here Louise Sawyer, Elizabeth Greenlaw, and Becky Millet in front of the Millet House. Again, that's 65 Conant Street. And Francis Millet is on the steps. You can just barely see him at the rear. And I remember growing up, the Millet family still lived there. And a good friend of mine lived in the house next door, which was also owned by the Millets and was rented from them. And so I can remember playing over there in his yard, and he always used to say, "Oh, here comes old man Millet." And old man Millet had a big old Buick or something he kept in the garage that had about 3 or 4 stalls that they shared with the people that were renting. And old man Millet didn't like ball playing and didn't like things thrown in his yard, and so of course the kids delighted in tormenting him by throwing things over in his yard continuously. But yeah, so I remember the Millets to some extent.
Every neighborhood has to have one of those fellows that
sure.
That makes for the pleasure of being around.
That's right. Give you that little something extra to do.
Okay, this was a Sawyer family collection picture we're looking at. Next, Miss Sadie Trask, horse and buggy, circa 1920.
This is right at the corner of Conant Street and Ellsworth Avenue, and the house in the background, looking at it from the Ellsworth Avenue side, is number 74 Conant Street, which is today still there and is now owned by the Knowlton family, and that's Kenneth Knowlton, who was the head of the Beverly Salem Water Board for many years, and I believe his son now, Tom Knowlton, is now the head of that water board. But anyway, they still live there, and this picture was taken right there about 1920. And again, you know, this is well into the automobile era, but there were still plenty of people driving around in horse and buggies at that time.
And program number 1, I believe we showed Sadie Trask's barn.
That's correct, which was across the street, sort of behind us, I guess, from where we're looking here.
Okay, and this is a Marjorie Widup collection.
Yeah, we're not really sure. Marjorie Martin Widup, and I will go on record calling it Widup unless we're corrected, corresponded with me, sent me quite a few pictures, but I never talked with her, so I really don't know how that name is pronounced.
But we thank her for doing that.
We certainly do.
Okay, number 13. Again, item 13 here on our agenda. Again, we have 2 pictures, Rich?
We have 2 pictures, that's correct.
The first one that we're showing is, again, Sarah Trask and Sadie Trask, dated about 1923.
And I think these are, again, in the realm of snapshots that this lady took, and, you know, what reason, who knows, the same reasons we take pictures on weekends and whatever. The companion picture to it with the 3 gals, she had labeled it herself, quote, dressing up, about 1921. Left to right, Rebecca Millet, Thelma Hay, that's probably the same Thelma Hay we just saw sitting in the 1904 Franklin, only a few years older now, and Marjorie Martin, who apparently is Marjorie Martin Widup, whose picture this is, and this is at the rear of 61 Conant Street.
And the outfits certainly are typical of the day.
They certainly look like that particular period of time, the 1920s, sure. Yep.
Well, now we come to one of these pictures here with many names to get through. So why don't we start by identifying the picture here as the Second Congregational Church, the Brown School Stage, I guess that was called.
That's right.
1925, and again a play or some type of...
It seems to be a play. They're all in some sort of costumes. It looks almost like colonial costumes with the knee socks and the long gowns and that sort of thing, but it wasn't really identified, so well, we really don't know.
Why don't you take the first row, Rich?
Okay. In the front, from the left, Ruth Wilson Gwynn, Rebecca, or perhaps Ursula, Millet, Evelyn Teague Fowler, Louise Raymond, and Jane Teague.
In row 2, Samuel Cushing, Matthew Cushing, Pearl or Dora, we're not sure which, Ludden, Julia Stanley, no D, Ray, R-A-E, Dollard, Elsie Cutler, Thelma Hay, Mabel Lewis, Guy Crosby, and Irving Gould.
And in the back row, again from the left, Ernest Brown, George Barron, Chick Fassett, there's a question mark there, we're not sure about that, but anyway, Helen Wilkins, Gladys Trask, again that would be my mother, Doris Nutter, Margaret Reynolds, John Gwynn, Clara Rugby, Maud Clark, Arthur LeMay, Ruth Stanley, again without a D, Beryl Reaver, Ernest Bays, Eleanor Stanley, again with no D, Charles Woodbury, and Ernest Mason. And we might add that the portrait hanging on the rear wall is Charles Brown, again the longtime principal of the Bass River School for whom that particular school, Brown School, was named.
Now we're talking 1925 here, and back in those days, I've read it was very popular to gather together for these theatrical productions. Neighborhood plays were much in vogue, and it was a way of people, young people and older people, coming together, joining in the neighborhood, which we see less of today, to a certain degree.
Well, I think, yeah, because back then, don't forget, you certainly didn't have television. You did have radio, but it wasn't what it became, 10 and 20 years later. You had movies, but they were silent. So really, you still didn't have the entertainment that you have today, where you can just turn something on, and so community gatherings were much more important than they are now.
Yep.
Absolutely.
And much looked forward to by not only the participants, but the audiences had a great time too.
That's right.
As the houses were usually packed as we read. This picture comes to us from Evelyn Fowler. Right?
Yes, she was a friend of my mother's.
Okay. From the Symmes family collection, we are looking at your dad here, I believe, about in the 1930s, and take it from there.
Yeah, that's my father, and his name was Louis Symmes, but he never was called Louis that I ever heard. Everybody called him Roddy, and that's because his middle name was Roderick, and so everybody called him Roddy, and that's all I ever heard him called. And he's standing in front of the house at 620 Cabot Street, and for many years he had a little stand out there which he called the Barbary Hedge, because of, quite naturally, the Barbary hedge that he had around the front of the house. And he sold vegetables and I guess today you'd almost call it convenience items in there, as well as candy and soda and things like that. And around the 4th of July he also carried fireworks, which he used to sell, and the kids used to shoot off because it was legal back in those days. In my memory, that was long gone because he had done away with it in the late 30s, and I was born in 1941.
Picture that we're looking at now that we just recently took kind of shows the house and the adjoining house more or less intact as it appeared back in the 30s here.
That's right. The house in the new picture on the right, that stucco house, is the infamous house which was in the way of 128 and which was picked up and moved across our front lawn and into its present location before the coming of the bridge about 1946, and we had covered that in one of the earlier programs.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I just love this next picture that we're going to show here. We have a bonfire here in the making here, dated 1935, and it's from the Don Goucher collection.
This is one of many, many bonfire pictures which Don Goucher gave to us, and a lot of them show these great stacks of tanning barrels, which of course became the norm, and they almost all look alike. But this one was unique, and I don't know if this was the first one, but it certainly probably was early on. And it looks like they gathered together anything that was combustible and put it in a pile and said, great, that's a bonfire.
They were learning the trade.
They were learning the trade, apparently, yeah. And the fellow in the picture, unfortunately, was not identified. If anybody knows who it is, they might want to call us and let us know.
But he's obviously proud of his...
Oh, you love that. You spent all day pitching that hay up in that pile and throwing those old tires up there, yeah. Yeah.
But like you say, later on they became nice...
Big conical-shaped towers. God, I think the biggest one in 1956, which was about the end of it, I think was, I think 50 rows of barrels high.
Yeah.
Oh, great, enormous thing.
And they would actually have to hire someone to watch over the, superintend the operation.
Oh, sure.
As we got nearer and nearer to the 4th of July.
Sure, someone was there 24 hours a day, because naturally it would have been a great thing to sneak in there at night and light it off.
Sure.
You know, and that would have ruined it.
Yeah. We have, unfortunately, the demise of the bonfire, though, this day and age.
I think that's because of, obviously because of pollution, you know, the environmental considerations of making all that smoke. You really don't have the open areas anymore where you could light off something like that and not worry about embers coming down and setting somebody's house on fire. And primarily you don't have the great supply of tanning barrels, those big old wooden barrels that you used to have that they just gave away.
They used to, I remember they had a big one down at Patton Park in Hamilton.
That's right.
And of course we could go over to Gallows Hill in Salem and view them on the 4th of July.
And of course here in North Beverly they were in 2 locations. The ones I remember were where the Star Market and Woolworth's stores are right now at the North Beverly Plaza, because that was all an open field. And again, I think 1956 was the last year that that was created at that location.
Well, 3 cheers for this one.
This is what started it. This is where they came from.
Obviously worked hard on that one.
That's right.
Okay. Item 17 coming up. Let's see. What do you have?
Well, we got some boys playing baseball here in the yard up at the Fowler House on Somerset Avenue, and one of them was identified as George Tozier up at bat, and we don't know who the fellow is catching behind him. But it's kind of a cute little picture, and again, this is the type of thing that people really shouldn't dispose of if they have a chance to give them to the Historical Society. I mean,